Hey everybody, this is Stream, and today we have a nice little college basketball slate. It's just 4 games. All 4 games have very tight uh, spreads. I think the biggest spread is 5 points between Toledo and Buffalo. That game also happens to be the highest scoring game at 167 points. Um, 2 other games are at 150 points. That's the Villanova St. John and Boise State New Mexico game. And then one game is way below that at 130 points, and that's the Richmond VCU game. But all these games are within a couple points, so I do think that they're all viable, especially if you can find value on any of the particular teams, which I think I've found some pretty good value on some of the teams. I'm definitely in favor of the Toledo Buffalo game. They seem to have the best value plays as well, just because of the pricing of some players and the potential of the game itself. But I do have some other players as well from other teams. I have 5 players for each position, guard and forward here, for you to consider. So let's go ahead and get into it. So first for guards, we're going to start with Dante. Let's see here. Dante Maddox Jr. He is my favorite player on the slate overall. Now, he has started most games this season. He's averaging 30 minutes a game lately. He's been sub 10 fantasy points once since he's been a starter, which was the first game he was a starter. And he's been over 20 fantasy points multiple times. He's the best value play on the slate overall. The only real concern with him is that he's a .72 fantasy points per minute. But I think he's a great play on the slate. I think he's going to have a lot of upside, and he's in a good spot to score a good amount of fantasy points. Then we'll look at Curtis Jones for Buffalo at $6,700. He's been really good playing over 30 fantasy points in 5 of the last 5 games. I will add that in one of those games he had 29.8 fantasy points, so just keep that in mind. But overall, he's playing his best ball right now. He's been really good all season long. He's too cheap for his potential and his ceiling, and he's got a pretty good floor for the price. I expected him to be a little bit more expensive, to be honest. Then we're going to look at Ray J. Dennis here for Toledo. Now, his price point is exactly where I expected it to be. He's not too cheap. He's not too expensive. He's been over 21 fantasy points every game this season and has a high ceiling, and his floor is pretty decent. His price is obviously a little bit high, but, is pretty high here, but he is useful today, especially considering the fact we're going to be able to fit in guys that are over $8,000 on our lineup with a lot of value available, so he's definitely somebody to consider. Armani Foster for Buffalo also looks really interesting today at $4,500. He starts and he's just too cheap for his production. He isn't as consistent as Dante Maddox, who I mentioned before, but he does have some good upside and he's a good value play on this on this slate. And if you want to go off Maddox and switch to Foster, then that's definitely something you can do to just be a little bit different. Then we'll look at Caleb Daniels for Nova. He has been playing really solid today. Lately. He's a good option. No game since game 3 under 23 fantasy points, and he has nice upside as well. He's a good alternative to Ray J. Dennis, and so I think that both him and Dennis both are going to have good games here, and so I definitely think he's somebody worth considering. He's also averaging .9 fantasy points per minute, so that's really solid for a guy over 8,000 at the guard position. Then we're going to look at our forwards. We're going to start with JT Shoemate. He's probably my favorite guy when it comes to the forwards today. He's priced a little bit lower than I expected it to be, but I do think he's priced right for his potential. He has a high ceiling, but his floor is a little bit lower than we would like it to be. But overall, he's a solid option on the slate in a high-scoring game, and he's also averaging over 1 fantasy point per minute at 1.05. So his price point is fair, and I think he's a viable option on the slate. Then we're looking at Tyson Degenhart for Boise State. Now, I'm a little concerned about that game simply because it could be a lower scoring game, but I do think he's viable here, and he has some nice upside with the situation he's in. He's played really well as of late. He's had some really big games, so he has a high ceiling. The question with him is his floor is a little bit lower, but again, he's very similar to Shoemate in price, and he is basically $100 cheaper and has just as much upside and a similar floor as well. So I think him and Degenhart are guys that you could either, choose one of them or even use both of them. It just depends on how you want to utilize the, value plays on the slate that are potentially good here. Then we're going to look at Eric Dixon for Villanova. Now he's been over 20 fantasy points in all but 2 games this season. He has a nice ceiling, but is a little bit lower than I typically want to pay for somebody that's close to $8,000. But he has some good upside, just despite that, in a high-scoring matchup, and that should be a benefit as well. But again, he's probably my least favorite of my 7,000 and above options on this particular slate that I mentioned, but he's still viable and probably one of the top options over that price point as well. Then we'll look at Najee Smith for Boise. Now he's starting and playing decent minutes most nights. Since starting, he started every game, and the risk here is a sub 15 fantasy point game. But he hasn't really done that since November 20th, so I think he's a really good option on the slate, especially in a decent matchup. Then we're going to look at, finally, Matt Grace for Richmond. Now, this is the lowest scoring game, so do keep that in mind. He is also minimum price, though, so that helps. Or pretty close to minimum price, rather. He is starting getting 28 minutes most nights, but he does have a low floor at around 10 fantasy points. But his ceiling is also really good in the mid-20s, so I do think he's viable, but he's probably not my favorite cheap option. But overall, he is viable on the slate and has some good upside. So that's what I have for the slate, guys. I will give you a look at my write-up here for this real quick, just so you can see that, and show you the guys that I've got here on this video. So thank you guys again for liking, commenting, subscribing. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. And have a nice day, guys. I'll leave this up here for a few minutes as well.